Hello, Professor Fiore. This is Thomas Willis, and my project today is on música latina de los 1990s. Now, although there are many genres in all types of cultures and languages, the four main ones that stood out in this decade were pop, Latin rock, salsa, and cumbia. To start off, like English pop, Latin pop was heavily produced and for mass consumption. Although Latin America was the biggest audience, by the end of the 90s, Latin pop was an international sensation. From the efforts of artists like Emilio and Gloria Estefan in the 80s and what they did to bring Latin American music to the United States, Miami, Florida became the hub for Latin pop to really get global. In the beginning of the 90s, on 1991, a 21-year-old singer, Luis Miguel, reintroduced the world to bolero, which is a very slow tempo Latin music, very instrumental, that derived from 40s to 60s and wasn't really heard of until the 90s when Luis Miguel brought it back to his music. This slow tempo music is what gave him the voice of romance in the 90s. Another very special thing about Luis Miguel is that for Latin pop, he was one of the only ones to not cross over to the Anglo market and make Spanish English music. He stayed strictly Spanish and was still very successful and worldwide with that. Next, we have Selena, which is also very well known worldwide and is considered one of the most significant Mexican American singers of the end of the 20th century. She was famous for using Tejano as a subgenre, and which is what represented the Mexican American culture. Tejano, translated, is basically Tex-Mex music, which brings cultures from northern Mexico and southern Texas, and is what made her so popular in the United States. Other artists that brought light to Latin pop early in the 90s were artists like Thalia, Linda Thomas, Chayanne, and Paulina Rubio. By the end of the decade, those that rose and were internationally known for their Spanish-English crossed-over music in Latin pop were artists like Ricky Martin with songs like She Bangs and Livin' La Vida Loca, Enrique Iglesias, who still makes music today, and of course Shakira, who just performed for the Super Bowl but started off her career in the 90s making strictly Spanish Latin pop. And she actually became very famous by the end of the decade, winning a Grammy in 1998. Here I have a song by Luis Miguel on his introduction to bolero to the 90s.
Y nunca más volviste a aparecer. Dejaste abandonada la ilusión que había en mi corazón por ti. Pero es que no supiste soportar las penas que nos dio la misma adversidad.
Now, next we have Latin rock. Recently beginning in the 1960s, Latin rock doesn't really take English and international interest till late in the 90s. By then it was also known as the name of Chicano rock, also rock en español. Artists did become internationally popular with this, with the help of a promotional campaign from the mid-1980s to the mid-1990s called Rock en tu idioma, which was basically targeted to the audience of Latin America that really liked the music in English of classic rock from bands like Van Halen or Kiss, but they just wanted to emphasize that this is the same type of classic rock, just en tu idioma, which translates to in your language. Latin rock is mostly known as a fusion of rock music with Latin American and Caribbean folkloric sounds. The breakthrough to an English audience was the introduction of MTV Latin America in 1993, where the first video shown was We Are Sudamerican Rockers by Chilean band Los Prisioneros, which were very popular, and actually the country of Chile was a huge part of bringing Latin American rock up a lot of bands derived from Chile. Latin rock also a subgenre that comes from Latin rock is also known as rock alternativo, a style that combined alternative rock with ska, reggae, and Latin folkloric elements. Having received 4 Grammys, the band Maná is the most known and famous rock alternativo band and is also my personal favorite. The band released Donde Jugaron los Niños, and the record sold over 3 million copies worldwide and became the best-selling Spanish-language rock album of all time. The band undertook an international tour with 268 concerts in 17 countries. Now, this band is actually a personal favorite of mine because I actually got to see them in concert with my mom back in Miami, Florida. And here is a bit of them in concert live, which I'm gonna skip to here.
Son muchas lunas las que te lloran. A tu casa yo fui y no te encontré. En el parque, en la plaza, en el cine yo te busqué. Te tengo atrapada entre mi piel y mi alma. Mas ya no puedo tanto y quiero estar junto a ti, rayando el sol, desesperación.
Now, next we have salsa. Now, salsa is a tropical genre of music that derives from African roots. It was born in the early 1930s but didn't get popularity in an international basis till the 90s. Now, unlike the other genres, this one derived from the Caribbean region and then spread all over to Latin America, sharing the dance music niche with cumbia, which we'll talk about after. Beginning in 1990, the salsa romantica that began in the 1980s becomes a standard in tropical music thanks to chart-topping stars, mainly from Puerto Rico. Some of these stars include Marc Anthony, Jerry Rivera, Tito Rojas, Victor Manuel, and Gilberto Santa Rosa. Marc Anthony, being the most famous with his success by the end of the decade, was known as the king of salsa. During the 90s, Marc Anthony took the Spanish music world by storm with his incredible vocal talent. His hit Y Hubo Alguien became the first salsa hit to ever hit #1 on Billboard Latin single charts. In the later part of the decade, the first World Salsa Congress was held in Puerto Rico. By the end of the decade, salsa's musical structure became very predictable and became difficult to distinguish one culture style from the next. It all kind of sounded the same, so you really had to know the culture to know the difference between a Cuban salsa song, a Puerto Riqueño salsa song, and a Colombian. Now, here to show for a little bit, I have the song Y Hubo Alguien. That was Marc Anthony's biggest hit for salsa music.
Con tu otra mitad, de repente te da por volver a sentir quién es el que en verdad sabe hacerte feliz. Pero se te olvidó que al marcharte de aquí, yo quedé igual que tú, libre para elegir. Dice, y hubo alguien que se encargó de darme todo, cada vez.
And lastly, we have cumbia. Now, the origin of cumbia music comes from the days of slavery in the late 17th century and is derived from African word cumbe, which means dance. I really like this quote that explains the culture of cumbia, and especially because I'm Colombian and that's where it really impacts the culture. The sound of the flute pierces the air like the call of an exotic bird and emits excitement of which every Colombian feels. Cumbia peruana, cumbia argentina, cumbia chilena, and cumbia mexicana are all different types of cumbias. However, it is known as Colombia's main folk style. Many would say that this music genre is what most accurately symbolizes Colombian nationality. Today, there are most commonly two different types of cumbia: those who use the traditional cactus wood flutes called gaitas, and those who purely percussion instruments called conjunto de cumbia. Now, here I have a short clip that really represents the Colombian heritage of what cumbia does and also shows the dance. And you can also hear the man before the introduction to the song telling you what cumbia is to the country of Colombia.
Cumbia, danza de la región Caribe, donde las mujeres con sus polleras cautivan a los hombres. ¡Cumbia!
And that is the end of my presentation.